This is Brent.
And this is Amanda.
We are the Unreliable Narrators.
Here to talk, today we're here to talk about book collecting. Thanks to Instagram user Maca9222, who asked us if we could cover the topic. And because this is something we love to talk about, we decided to do so. So here we are, episode 34, book collecting.
Yeah, just diving in the deep end.
Yeah, well, if it's your hobby, been your hobby for a long time, it's going to be pretty easy to talk about it. You ever see those Reddit threads that are like, what is one topic that you would have, you could talk for 1 hour with no preparation about for $10,000? And there are many, many such topics, but this is definitely one of them for me.
Yeah.
All right, Brent, what is book collecting?
Oh, okay. Just a hot potato.
Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, so I have some somewhat strong opinions about this.
Shocked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for any sort of collecting in general, I make distinctions between collecting and accumulating or hoarding.
An important distinction.
Yeah, and in my mind, the main differences between those are proper storage.
Okay.
So if you are going to collect something, and this doesn't matter if it's Pokemon cards or video games or coins or books or cars or
ceramic figurines or Fabergé eggs.
yeah, anything. So proper storage.
Okay.
And then there also needs to be some knowledge or aspect of cleaning or conservation.
Yeah, so some kind of care of the thing and preservation of the thing.
Yeah, and then organization. So if somebody says, hey, I wanted to look at this thing you had, can you find it quickly? Do you know where it's at?
Or at least reasonably quickly.
Yeah, reasonably quickly. And then the ability to pass on the thing after you no longer need or want it, or it's no longer part of the collection.
I think that's an important distinction because hoarding is at least partly the inability to let go of a thing or release it, where in a collection, there should be some natural shaping and growth of the collection where something that you acquired at one point no longer fits with the collection, no longer fits with your tastes, and can you release it, let it go? Resell it or pass it on to someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are important distinctions. I do like the saying, it's not hoarding if it's books, because if we're just talking about the sheer number of items I own in the book category, you could call it hoarding just because it's such a high volume of things. Or I call myself a book dragon sometimes because I have a hoard or a treasure pile of books. But of course, it's not a pile. They are neatly shelved and carefully cared for. And so I think that is an important distinction. So I think collecting is really interesting because there's just a huge variety of ways people go about it. There's a book collecting category for most any taste or budget. There are lots of people who collect in different and disparate ways. You know, both you and I tend to collect in a very similar way, but there are people who collect just one niche interest, one very like books on mining or books on anthropology or, you know, so it might be like an academic interest or something of that nature. And they have essentially every publication they can acquire on that one particular topic. And their collection is very coherent and very focused. They're also...
Yeah, I've been over to people's houses where one time I was invited over, older gentleman, and I'm trying to remember exactly what it was, but he had this strong fascination with Westerns, but it was a very specific Western, and I don't remember what it was. And then he had like a bunch of nonfiction around, like
right.
So it was just, it was like he had several thousand books,
but it was one very specific topic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And after you'd read probably 3 of those books, you probably knew more than you needed to.
Than the majority of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then there are people who collect maybe just a particular author or a couple of particular authors that they enjoy. And so they try to acquire every book that person wrote or every edition or publication of that author's works. There are commonly people who collect things that are from particular eras. There are manuscript collectors and incunabula collectors, manuscripts being any handwritten text, typically from before the invention of printing, although manuscripts continued for about 100 years after that. Incunabula being anything from, about 1440 to 1500, the earliest printed books. But you have to be quite wealthy to do that. But then there are plenty of people who collect, 18th century literature or 19th century essays or, broader categories in the very niche interest, but very specific time periods. I think typically people tend to collect more modern literature. That's what's accessible for anybody who's middle class and up. And that would be anything from the last couple hundred years. And typically book collectors are collecting modern first editions. Although, like I said, there's a category for every budget, and there are people who collect, the cheap everyman's, because they were affordable and for the masses, they try to collect everyman's library editions or modern library editions or, the Penguin paperbacks, the little orange paperbacks, and look to have a complete collection of those.
Yeah. So a question, comment first. That makes sense. Like your average person, the way this probably starts is you walk into Barnes and Noble and then you're like, oh, here, this new author that I like, or they have a new book out.
Right.
And so you pick it up, and that's probably how a lot of people started, because then you're like, oh, wait, it's a first, and then they go from there. But you touched on another thing. Do you think that having a complete run of something is important for collecting? Or
well, I do think that the completist impulse is pretty common in people who become collectors. And so looking for the full set, whether it's every published work by an author or every work published in a particular edition, or trying to have a first from every Pulitzer Prize winner or something like that. That completist impulse is very strong.
Yeah. Okay. So you wouldn't say it's part of a collecting handbook. It's probably more of a personality trait that
I think
people have.
Yeah, that's okay. What gets us into this kind of thing in the first place, is the desire to see something whole and complete and finished in some sense, although no collection is ever finished.
Yeah. No, I agree with that.
I've often heard the expression that collecting books and reading books are two separate but complementary hobbies. Do you have any thoughts or feelings on that idea?
Oh, yeah. I strongly agree with that. So what ends up happening is I will often end up with 2 or 3 copies of a book.
Listeners, sometimes he has 5 copies of a book.
Well, so if you pay a little bit more money,
yes,
I'm using air quotes here because depending on the author, like it could be more or less, but if you pay more money to get a signed edition,
yes,
the last thing I want to do is be taking that out and then like it might, it's like, oh, I might get something spilled on it. Or so
personal anecdote. I found out last week as I went to reread one of my favorite books from the last 20 years, Susanna Clarke's Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Good book.
It's such a good book. And and the kind of book that makes you want to collect more books, because Mr. Norrell is an inveterate book collector, and just hearing the descriptions about his book collecting makes me want to go buy books. But I went to grab my copy off the shelf, and I opened it up and started flipping through it, and I realized, I knew it was a first edition. I realized it was a signed first edition. And I was literally going to put it in my backpack and go to the coffee shop with it. And so I found myself on a random Wednesday morning needing to go find a reading copy because it was the only copy I had. And I've read that signed first edition, I think twice.
Oh.
Because I had a non-signed first edition. I read it, loved it so much, purchased a signed first edition, and then I think I gave you my non-signed first edition, and then forgot, I guess, that it was an autographed first. And anyway, so now I have a reading copy and an autographed first of it. So, whew. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because that's the last thing I want to do. Because
right.
It's that terror in there where you're like, oh,
yeah,
each time I turn a page, I'm decreasing the value of.
Well, and I'm very careful typically with my books, but there is always the chance that something bad could happen. And just the wear and tear of reading does loosen the binding slightly, and the small bits of wear show. So, yeah. Anyway, so you'll have multiple copies because sometimes you want to have have a collectible copy. You also want to have a reading copy.
Yeah, because the love of the object, but then also the love of the literature.
Right.
They're two separate things and they come together in the book.
Yeah.
But it like books are fragile.
Yeah. And I felt a little silly sometimes because of this, because I do very much care about the book as an object, and I tend to be quite careful with all of my books. I'm not casual with any of them. I will mark in books if I'm studying them, but definitely not in a collectible edition of a book. But even when I'm doing that, I'm cautious about it. I'm not dog-earing pages or doing anything horrifying like that. Pencil marks and maybe a little gentle highlighting, which Brent will not do, but I do. So I tend to be very careful about the book anyway, but then I'm also going to get a collectible copy that I will be more careful about. And I'm unwilling to read books in a digital format. So this means that my book collecting and book reading hobbies are taking up, reasonable amounts of space in my house. So
yeah. Now I will use an e-reader.
Yeah.
Just because it's easier to take to work.
Which makes a lot of sense. And I ought to like an e-reader because I do a certain amount of traveling, and I often, always have the problem of my luggage is too heavy to carry because I have too many books in it. Usually because I'm taking a few with me to read, many if it's a multi-week trip is, 10 books easily. And then I'm also usually acquiring more books while traveling, and so it does become kind of silly. And so I wish I could enjoy an e-reader. I have a hard time with them, and it's perhaps I just haven't tried the right one. So
it could be.
Yeah.
It's also an acquired. It's hard too because I work in IT.
Yeah.
So an e-reader to me is part of the work world. Even like we're not doing work on e-readers, but it's too much like a computer.
Right.
So it feels intrusive.
Right. Okay, so let's just take a minute and talk a little bit about some of the vocabulary around book collecting, because this is the part that maybe would be helpful if someone's getting into book collecting and would like to understand kind of what's going on when they're shopping for books.
Yeah, that's true. We've already thrown around first edition.
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to start, first edition. So there are two things to pay attention to in the edition of a book. And so the truly collectible edition, and this is true for the vast majority of cases, although there are some notable exceptions, is the first edition, first printing. Mm-hmm. So edition is the first typeset for the book. So the words are all in the same places. The pagination is all the same. There haven't been any corrections or edits from this initial print. There are also then multiple printings sometimes of a book. So something like, The Hobbit, which was immediately popular, but much more popular than expected, meant that the first edition went through more than 25 printings. So it's the same typeset of the book, but then they ran off, and I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's, they ran off the first 1,000 books and sent them out, and they sold quickly. And so then they printed another 1,000 books, and then that's the second printing.
Yeah.
And typically, publishers will mark the book with some kind of code that tells you whether or not it's a first edition and whether or not it's a first, second, 47th printing. Now, this gets a little bit messy because some books are called first edition when they are not a first edition in the collectible sense. They're a first thus, which is maybe there was some significant change to the text, some significant addition or something. And then they're now, okay, it's first thus, but it's not really a collectible edition.
Okay.
And the printing distinctions, whether this is a first, second, third, fourth printing, each publisher has their own custom for distinguishing printings. Typically, it's a printed number line. Sometimes the number line runs in reverse. Sometimes there is one set of numbers running forward and another set of numbers running backwards.
Oh.
Sometimes it uses letters. And sometimes there is no distinguishing mark for the first edition, first printing that requires specialized knowledge of that particular book.
Fun.
I know. Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, no. So that makes sense. What you're describing there. So new book comes out, the publishers they're sure they can sell it, but then they're not entirely sure how popular it's going to be.
Right.
So then if sales are good, then
they run off another printing.
Yeah, okay. So then that's where we get second and third printings.
Right.
And then the I think I know the answer to this, but I'll ask because I'm sure somebody might be listening and thinking the same thing. So with the first thus,
yes.
So you use The Hobbit as an example.
Right.
So I know that there was a change in the text of The Hobbit, mostly around the riddles in the dark scene.
That chapter, yep.
Yeah, so would that be a first thus, or is that a...
Yeah, so that's actually a first revised edition.
Okay.
So first thus it's actually essentially a nonsensical designation. It's used by some booksellers to, I honestly think it's a dishonest practice to skate by an inattentive buyer. Because in one sense, anything other than a second or later printing of a particular edition could be called first thus, because a new edition, a second edition or a third edition requires some change for it to be a new edition. And it may be a very minor change. We may be correcting a word or two that got misprinted or some small emendation like that. But you'll see, if you go on, abebooks.com, which is one of my favorite sites for shopping for books, and sort by, author and title, and then select first edition, you will see many books listed first thus, and they've marked the category first edition, but it's a later softcover reprinting of no significance or importance whatsoever. And yes, they're technically correct. It's the first thus. It's the first with this illustrator, or it's the first with this introduction, but it has no collectible value whatsoever. And so an unwary or amateur new collector might get scammed into purchasing something that is not actually collectible, doesn't really have value.
Yeah, so what you're describing there, I'll just use The Hobbit again as an example.
Right.
So you could have a situation where, for whatever reason, in this year, whichever year the listeners listening in,
right.
They decide to put a new edition of The Hobbit out because some new illustrator.
Right.
So Tolkien's dead. He's already passed away. But if they put new, never before seen illustrations in there, that could be a first thus.
Yes, yes, or a new introducer, an introduction by someone new, whoever the popular best-selling author in 2045 is.
Well, yeah, isn't that like with your Susanna Clark?
Yes,
V.E. Schwab was the one that wrote the introduction to that,
yes,
right? Yeah.
Yes, and incidentally, in that introduction, there is some massive typographical error, which I won't get into the details of now, but I was shocked by it. Yeah, so then as far as collecting goes, with something like The Hobbit, someone might be interested in collecting each edition, each issue of The Hobbit. So they want a first. They also want a second edition first printing. They also want the first revised edition first printing. They want him the first from the British publisher and the American publisher. They want the deluxe edition. They want the Alan Lee illustrated edition. They want all of the editions of The Hobbit. And that means, in some sense, all of those are collectible. But The Hobbit is a good example of this because it is such a collectible book. There are so few surviving first editions. You've got to be interested in some other version of the book in order to have something to collect. Like I have a very nice illustrated deluxe edition. It's the nicest copy of The Hobbit I'll probably ever own. It's a $35, slip-cased. I picked it up at a book fair. I'm very happy with it, but it's not anything like a first edition in the collectible sense. When it comes to other books that had larger first runs that are less hugely popular, essentially nothing but that first edition, first printing is of any collectible value whatsoever. Even talking about, Gene Wolfe, there are people who are happy, delighted, and God bless them. It's a wonderful thing to be delighted by, like a book club edition of The Shadow of the Torturer. Like, look, it's a hardcover. I like it. I'm happy with it. And it's good for them to enjoy that. That's not a collectible edition in the book collecting sense, in the larger book collecting world. It might be something that a person collects, but it's not going to be a high value item.
Yeah.
All right. So that was one vocabulary term.
One vocab. And I guess the main takeaway is that buyer beware, because
certainly
there are some people out that will use the terminology to try to get you to buy something that isn't what you think it is.
Yeah. And you can honestly say first edition about something that's the 37th printing, because it is the first edition. It's just not the collectible first. And so you have to really watch for that.
Yeah.
And maybe when we talk a little bit later about times and places to buy books, we can get into how to pay attention to those things.
Okay. So what do you have for us next?
So gradings. So if you go on a website to purchase a used book, they will typically be described as being in some kind of condition or other. And if you are reading a description and it says it's in good condition, you might think that that's a good thing. But good in the technical book collecting gradings sense means hot garbage. So it doesn't mean good.
So as a man, were my answer to how are you doing? Oh, I'm good.
Yes, I'm is
hot garbage.
Hot garbage. That's
okay.
It. Yes. So the gradings go in order from best to worst. New, as new, fine, near fine, very good, good, fair, poor. Now, very good is the very bottom of acceptable collectible condition. You're going to get less for a book if you're selling it, or you're going to pay less for a book, much less, if it's rated very good versus if it's rated fine. When you get down to good, fair, poor, with a few notable exceptions, The Hobbit being one of them, a true first edition in anything less than very good condition is essentially uncollectible, because the vast majority of book collectors want their books to be in the nicest possible shape. So if you're looking at something that says it's new, it should look like it just came out of the shrink wrap. As new, it came out of the shrink wrap a few days ago. Maybe it's accumulated a little bit of dust.
Okay.
Fine. It may not look quite exactly new, as in it looks like maybe someone has opened it a few times, but there are really no obvious marks of any kind on it. No dirt, no smudges, no tears of any kind. There's no wear or scuffing of any kind on it.
Yeah. No dog-eared pages.
Exactly. Near fine would be fine, but with maybe one very small mark or problem. It might be slightly less than crisp. There might be one smudge on one page, or maybe one of the corners is slightly bumped or bent.
Question here.
Yes.
How so if a book comes with a dust jacket,
yes.
Are you factoring in the dust jacket's condition to that?
That is such a good question. Booksellers typically, I would think almost exclusively, booksellers rate the book itself and the jacket separately.
Okay.
So any competent bookseller will have listed the book's condition and separately listed the dust jacket's condition. Like if you're listing your books on like abebooks.com, their software has a separate ratings section for the book and for the dust jacket. And that's pretty universal in descriptions.
Okay.
And so it's most common for the book itself to be in slightly better condition than the dust jacket because the dust jacket is just more ephemeral, more subject to wear.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then very good. You're looking at a book that's tight and whole, but it probably has a little bit of scuffing or may have a mark or two on it. If we're talking about the dust jacket, there might be some slight wear on the edges, maybe a little wrinkling or a slight tear or two. By the time you get down to good, I can't even list all of the possible problems that you'd be talking about. Fair and poor, you're looking at a book that's barely holding together, very dirty, or significantly damaged in some way.
Okay. So I got two questions based off what you said there. One, around the grading. So do product defects go into that grading? So, for example, like what I'm thinking, so say like you have a hardcover and there's, one of the end papers where there's some glue, but that glue, like it's bulged out, seeped out, and then so you got some glue where it's not supposed to. Does that?
But that was a manufacturing error.
Yeah, but it wasn't like something that I, as an owner of it, did to the book, but it came that way. Does that?
Typically, those things are described separately.
Okay.
So I think that would be up to an individual bookseller's judgment how they classified the condition of the book. But in a description, they would list it as a printer's error or something of that nature. Okay. And there's some pretty common errors that happen where you'll end up with a page that's folded back slightly and before it was cut, and so you have an odd extra bit of paper or an odd crease in something. If those make
them super valuable, right?
No,
they don't.
They don't. The kinds of errors that can make a book super valuable are printer errors where there is an incorrect word or phrasing, particularly if it provides humor or irony or contrast of some sort, and where that error was caught quickly and then that print run was continued. So you might have a first of a particular book. And I can't think of a actual example at the moment. I wish I had done a little bit of research. But let's say if it was Catcher in the Rye, and the printer was doing the first print run, and the first 100 books off the press had a word error that was caught by the publishing company.
Okay.
And they corrected it, and then continued with the print run. But they didn't throw away those first 100 books. They shipped them out because while it was an error, it was probably not one that was going to cause people to return books to bookstores, so they send it out. Those exceptional 100 books could become extremely collectible because of their scarcity and because it's an error that maybe doesn't detract from the value of the book.
Okay. But in general...
Yes. In general, manufacturing errors, like a title page printed upside down or a pagination error or something like that doesn't typically add value.
Okay.
It's only exceptional cases where it does. But then in those exceptional cases, it adds a lot of value and is therefore extra interesting.
Okay. And then the other question, which I'm pretty sure that I know the answer to this, but when you're talking below good, what I imagined was... like the Goodwill or Youth Ranch, bins where you can just, or like at the library book sale where it's like, oh, here's the slop pile.
Yeah, and it literally looks like somebody used a snow shovel to pick them up and dump them into a carton or something. Yeah, okay. Just really poor shape.
Yeah, and so then I guess part of that, which we'll come into later, but when we're talking about passing on books or letting them go, these are ones that... just because somebody has if your family member passes away and it's like, oh, look at all these books.
Yeah.
Okay. So that would be an instance where it's like, okay, just take them to a donation center.
Yeah. And this is actually where I'm going to be controversial and you listeners can come for me.
Oh, I have no clue what you're going to say.
Books die. And so sometimes a book dies and not every book is worth keeping. I have a very high sense of the value of books. Books as quasi-sacred objects makes a ton of sense to me. I do believe in that to some extent. But like a torn and tattered flag, sometimes destruction of the book is actually the best thing because it is so damaged, soiled, or just was such a poor book to start with. It probably just needs to be composted or I know I'm going to say burned. But like, not in a, like, we want to destroy knowledge kind of way, but in a, this is not a usable object anymore. And it just needs to be treated like its life is over and it can be buried. And I think that that's an okay thing. So yes, if you have a relative that passes away and they have, 57 worn and tattered romance novels that probably cost 25 cents when they were new, it's okay to let them go with the garbage. I think that that's a defensible position.
Yeah, I'm not gonna. You say controversial, and I'm like, well, yeah, no, I agree with that, but.
Well, just saying burn and book in the same sentence, I think, is a little triggering, which I get. But
yeah, well, it's it's like with the Bible. When the Bible gets old and worn, like the respectful thing to do is you burn the old copy, and I think this is probably something Christians picked up from Jews, but because the Jewish people are very sensitive about the printed name of God and any title that is associated with God. So you're not like, oh. Toss my Bible out. Okay, dump the coffee grounds in the cat litter box. Like, so it's burning it is seen as the respectful thing to do. So.
Right, because it's a clean disposal. You're not putting it in with the cat turds and yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Some other vocabulary about description of the condition of a book. So bumping is often used, and that describes the ends of the spine or the corners of the cover that can get bumped, literally, from being shelved carelessly, that kind of thing. So if you read, has bumping, it means that the corners aren't perfectly sharp or the head and tail of the spine aren't perfectly sharp. Likewise, shelfware is exactly what it sounds like. It's the scuffing along the bottom of the book as it has been shelved and reshelved. A tight binding is one where, whoever read it was careful and gentle with it, or it hasn't been read. Shaken is where the binding has been kind of cracked in some way.
Oh, okay.
Super obvious in a paperback, although that will also often be described as cracked or creased. But in a hardcover, if someone's been too rough with it, then the binding just feels loose. And so shaken is the description for that.
Okay. If there are pages falling, like if it's to the point where a page is falling out, would shaken still?
No, that would be loose and or partially disbound.
Okay.
If there are pages loose, that needs to be explicitly called out in a description. If it's not, again, that's a deceptive practice.
Okay.
Started is used for the beginnings of a tear or for the beginnings of, especially the beginnings of a tear along the binding. If you read, has started, that means that possibly the cover is partially coming off. It hasn't come off. The fabric or the paper is holding, but it's on its way. So it'll either need some kind of reinforcement or repair or very gentle handling. Talking about dust jackets, there's language for tears, obviously, for any kind of tear to the dust jacket. Typically, these will be described with links, millimeters, centimeters, or inches, how long each tear is. Some small tears, that might actually end up being essentially invisible to the eye, because a very careful bookseller will note even the very smallest beginnings, and that paper is pretty thick, and so very small tears aren't often very visible. But then there are often, 1, 2, 3-inch tears on a dust jacket. Chips is the other word that's used, which is where a piece of the dust jacket is missing. And those should be described by size as well.
Okay, so that's like kind of like if it's flaking.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So it looks like little pieces have torn away. And that often happens with very old dust jackets that were made out of somewhat acidic paper. Little pieces chip away or flake away pretty easily.
Yeah.
And then there are lots of other words to describe aging for books.
Before you go on,
yes.
clipped is one that I see.
Yes.
What's that?
So that's prices are typically printed on a dust jacket, and that's actually a very good marker for the distinction between a normal printing and a book club edition, because book clubs are sold by subscription. They don't have prices on them. Regular editions have a price printed on the dust jacket. It's on the inside flap, the front inside flap in the upper corner.
Okay.
And so price clipped is where somebody cut off the corner of the jacket to take the price off. And so that's a very common practice, or was a very common practice. I don't know if it still is, but just like if you're going to give a book as a gift, you would take the price off of it so that nobody could see it. And so a non-price clipped jacket is somewhat more valuable than a price clipped one, but a price clip is not a significant flaw for most things.
Okay.
It's also, if it's not price clipped, it's easier to identify the edition because there will be different prices at different editions or publications.
Okay.
So a non-price clipped dust jacket is obviously the best. Yeah. Then there's lots of language about toning, spotting, sunning, fading to describe just the way that color and oxidation affect a book. So pretty common is the spine to be sun faded, because if sun comes in your windows and shines on your library, then the spines are going to be lighter colored than the sides. Also discoloration, different inks react differently to sunlight. And so something that was reddish could become yellowish as it fades. And that's a pretty common thing with older books.
Yeah.
But toning and spotting have to do with the acidity of the paper reacting to oxygen.
Okay.
And so often most often that's sort of a uniform browning of the paper, but sometimes it's a very spotty browning of the paper. And so you'll see that sometimes just the end papers, because the end papers are a different paper, and so they might be more acidic. And sometimes you'll see it throughout a book, lots and lots of little spots, little brown spots.
Yeah. No, I see that on the old pulp magazines. Like they start out clean, like they used to be on white paper. But
right.
Then it's, if you get one that hasn't fully turned brown yet, they are.
It's surprising.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, less acidic paper is just more expensive to produce. And so the cheaper the book or the printing is, the higher the acidity of the paper in general.
Yeah, which makes sense. Like a lot of those older magazines, they were meant to be read and then discarded.
Oh, used as toilet paper.
Well, yes. You take them to the outhouse.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, of course, there's also the wartime phenomenon. So all books in the U.S. Printed during World War II were printed according to government standards for paper use, which meant that they were printed on much cheaper, much more acidic paper than was normal immediately before or after the war. And so some of those books are essentially dust at this point because the paper was so highly acidic. Yeah.
In Great Britain, they had a similar thing. And so,
right.
So a lot of times the books from that time period, at least in the U.S. and in English books, English is the printed language, they'll be, the size is smaller.
Yes,
and they look really thin, even though they're, it's like, oh, wow, that's a 400-page book. And it
looks really slender.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, I've got to say the effort during the war to print and distribute classic literature to the troops was enormous. Both the British and the U.S. governments spent a lot of money getting inexpensive paperback copies of books to the troops so that soldiers would have things to carry with them and to read. And, immediately after the war, in Britain anyway, I don't know, in the U.S., there was a resurgence in interest in the English classics because of that distribution scheme. Yeah, so that toning, spotting thing leads to the question of foxing versus mold. I would not have expected this, but the book collecting subreddit has a preponderance of posts asking about the spots on different books. Is this foxing or is this mold? Now, foxing, of course, is a description of that acid spotting that we've talked about.
Uh-huh.
And mold, of course, is one of, 1,000 different possible spore carried growths that could be on your books.
Yeah. That subreddit gets tedious at times.
It does. Well, you have to think that the person asking the question is asking it for the first time, or very often coming to that subreddit for the very first time. And most people don't understand search functions. But it does get a little old sometimes. So in my experience, if you are taking a picture of your book and asking, the vast majority of the time, it's foxing. Foxing is brown or brownish spots of some sort. They don't have any kind of raised texture, although the spots can vary widely in tone, and an individual spot could have a number of tones within it. So typically, I'm not saying it's not mold, but it's usually foxing.
Yeah. And if it looks like the cheese that you left in the refrigerator for too long,
that's gross.
Then it's probably mold.
Yes. And we can talk more about that when we talk about book care, but mold is a very serious concern for books. Foxing is a normal part of life. Mold is an abnormal thing and a failure of something.
So what you're saying is that foxing is the liver spots of the books, just like humans just get the sunspots.
Yes, yeah, okay. Liver spots, yeah, age spots.
Sorry, yeah. Sorry for using an antiquated term there.
I know, yeah, no, it just, you say liver spots, and it immediately sounds like you're describing somebody who's, I don't know, 90, and the spots are dark and large and maybe distracting. But when it comes to age spots, I think, maybe I'm just trying to get away with calling them freckles, but I think we all have those. Once you're past 35, I don't know. Yeah, so we haven't really talked about bindings yet. I know that
makes sense. They're like the binding's the least important part of a book, right?
No, it holds it together.
Oh.
So this is something that we bonded about early on. Hardcover or paperback, Brent?
Well, hardcover.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Sewn binding or perfect binding? Perfect binding sounds really good. It's called perfect, right?
Yeah, it's called perfect, but sewn.
Sewn, yeah. So I think hardcover versus paperback is super obvious. There are obviously some edge cases or some variations there. Soft cover can include different covering materials than paper or cardstock.
Yeah.
And hardcover obviously has a huge variety of materials involved, everything from leather or vellum up to paper over boards. And the boards themselves can be anything from compressed pasteboard to actual wood.
Yeah.
So although a lot of early bindings were then just glue laminated manuscript pages. So there are actual texts that the only copies of them we have were scraps that had been pressed into service, literally pressed into service as a cover for another book.
Yeah, there's the Spalding. They used their primer for the.
Yes.
So the only example of it that exists, they pressed it to make a cover for another. Yeah. And I can't remember which Indian language it was now, but.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, people can look. They were early missionaries in northern Idaho.
Yes.
And the odd people that came out to the frontier.
Yeah.
So.
Which you would have to be odd. Yeah, and then a sewn binding versus a perfect binding. So a sewn binding is where you are taking sheets of paper that are about twice the size of your page and printing pages on both sides, and then folding those pages together into little groups called signatures that are then literally stitched together with thread. And then each of those, which is called a signature or gathering, is stitched to the next one. And they are sewn together and then put into a cover. Now, you can have a sewn binding with a hardcover or a sewn binding with a soft cover, paperback or otherwise.
Ignatius Press does a lot of the sewn, but with a soft cover.
Yeah, I really like their editions because of that. Sewn bindings wear much better. They're much more durable and long-lasting than their opposite, which is called perfect binding. I think the name coming from, oh, look how cheap and easy this is, not for its durability. And perfect binding is where you take a stack of pages and they're all one size and you've trimmed them down and you have basically like a small brick of paper and then you smear glue on the binding side of it, and that glue holds it together, and then you stick it into your cover. And you can have a perfect binding in a paperback, which is most common, or you can find they now do hardcovers with perfect bindings. And so a hardcover is no guarantee of a sewn binding.
Yeah.
And the downside of a perfect binding is that they just don't hold up as well. It's much easier to break that binding and then have pages come loose and fall out.
A binding method that the way you described it sounds like a kindergartner craft project doesn't hold up.
Yes. But
it's shocking.
The reason it's popular is that it's much less expensive. It's because it's not so time consuming.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't require specialized specialized equipment, and it takes less time and material. So
yeah, and despite my complaining, I also am grateful for perfect bindings, because there's plenty of times where I'm like, well, I don't know if I'm gonna like this author. I don't like,
an extremely inexpensive paperback is a great way to find out.
Yeah.
And I'm also a big fan of literature and entertainment in the form of books being widely accessible, and so I'm willing to plop down $40 on a brand new hardcover. But I'm also in the privileged position where I can afford to do that with some regularity, and not everyone is. And so $8 paperbacks, that's helpful for society.
It is.
Although
so is the media mail system. But...
oh, that is a good thing. Yes. United States Postal Service subsidizes the mailing of books by a special rate that they lose money on sending books through the mail, which is the only way it makes it affordable to mail books around. And instituted as a government policy in order to aid in education and literacy. So highly ranked.
Yes. Look it up. It's a good thing.
Yeah, we support this. All right. So then hardcover or paperback, but mostly hardcover, you can end up with a dust jacket. And dust jackets are super interesting to me because they were originally invented as a throwaway piece of paper to protect the binding. So they were meant by publishers as a throwaway piece of paper. They would wrap each book individually. And then they got to the point where it was like, oh, hey, look at all of this free space. We could advertise the book on it. And then the bookseller wouldn't have to unwrap the book because it could just sit on the shelf with this dust jacket, this dust wrapper. They were called dust wrappers originally. So it protects the book from dust. And by printing the title and the author and maybe, some graphics on it, then people can see it. And now the dust jacket itself is a collectible part of a whole book.
That's interesting, but that makes sense because it's, at first I was like, wait, what are you talking about? But it's okay if you have it wrapped and it's like so in transport, so it's not getting beat up or like scuffed.
Yeah.
And
they were designed a little bit differently than they are now. So they were made larger than the book, and then they folded over the edges of the book. So it wasn't like it was taped together like a parcel, but it was folded over the book edges. So you see dust jackets now, the flaps come over and inside, but they used to be made so that at the top and bottom, the paper folded down into the book itself and protected it from dust.
Okay.
So, yeah. And now I have books that have dust jackets on them, and I buy special protective covers for the dust jacket. So I have a dust jacket for my dust jacket, basically.
Well, it only makes sense.
Yeah. So Brodart is the brand I use. I know there are others that are made, but as far as I'm concerned, Brodart is so good. You wouldn't want to use any other brand anyway. But they have...
Not sponsored.
No, but if you want to, Brodart, if you want to send me any free Brodarts, I will take them. So they're a library supply company, and they manufacture a number of archival materials, but I use their well, we both do. I keep saying I. Brent is as obsessive about this as I am. And I think actually just last night, went out late at night to get some tape because he was out of tape for brodarting a book jacket.
Yes.
Yeah, so they're made out of mylar on the outside, so they're see-through, and then paper on the inside, and you just slip the book jacket in, fold the paper down to be the same size as the jacket, and then fold the mylar cover over and tape it to the paper that belongs to the brodart, not to the jacket itself. You don't ever want to get tape on your dust jackets if you can avoid it. And it just provides a nice protective cover so you don't get fingerprints on your book jacket. And it's also, they're waterproof. So if, heaven forbid, you sneeze near your books, they're protected.
At least on the book jacket side.
At least on the book jacket side.
Yeah. And so where these are archival, like one of the things that we were talking about earlier with the acid, you're not going to get the acidity in the paper, and there's not going to be any off-gassing. So around archival quality items, there's actually very strict standards. So with off-gassing, if you like the new car smell,
yes, that's poison.
Yeah, that's poison. That's just off-gassing of all of the plastics and the glues and the different cloths and cleaners they have. So.
And that all that off-gassing can cause damage to books.
Yeah.
Or paper in any form.
So archival quality materials, no off-gassing, no acidity. So
I just have a couple more book collecting comments maybe, and then we can talk about a little bit about what to do with your books once you've collected them. One thing that was brought up in the comment that prompted this whole podcast was the black marks on the tops or bottoms of the text block of various books, and how that seems to decrease their value. So those marks, usually done with a Sharpie or Sharpie-like marker, they're called remainder marks. And it's typically just a black or dark or some other dark mark at the top of the text block or at the bottom of the text block of the book. And they happen because, like we talked about, the opposite problem with The Hobbit, where they didn't print nearly as many copies of The Hobbit as people wanted, so they almost immediately were doing a second printing. Sometimes that first printing is larger than the market demand for the book. And so the publisher sees that the book is not selling at the booksellers, and so they decide that they're going to have to take a loss on this book, and so they mark all of them with a remainder mark, and then send them to low-cost resellers. So Half Price Books is probably the largest one that, well, here in our community, it's the only store that takes remaindered books. So if a book has been remaindered, that just means that the initial print run was too large, it hasn't been selling, and so now it's being sold at a very steep discount. But they won't sell it at the discount without damaging it in some way, thus the remainder mark. So typically, books that have been remaindered are not collectible anyway because they weren't popular enough, or if they become popular later after they've been remaindered, the remaindered copies are somewhat less valuable than the non-remaindered copies.
Wow, that's unfortunate.
It is. It makes sense as a publishing practice, but I don't like it.
Yeah, I don't like it either. I was going to say it's similar to the people collect vinyl. The stores used to put they had the hole punch, and they'd put it up in the corner of the album cover. So they were essentially remaindered.
And then the last thing I wanted to mention is that if you see a used book for sale and it says that it's an ex-library copy, it is, collectively speaking, worthless. You may be fine with it as a reading copy, but even as a reading copy, an ex-library book is a book that has been in the library system so long that the librarians have decided to retire it and then stamped it or marked it in some way that they've discarded it, but it still has, the glued on pocket, the barcodes, the various marks like owned by this library. Typically, the dust jacket is actually in a brodart, but the way that libraries do brodarts, they tape the brodarted jacket to the book itself. So the book and the jacket are taped together, which is very difficult, if not impossible, to remove without damage. The spine will have a glued-on label. as far as collectors are concerned, ex-library is worthless. So just be aware of that.
The beacon of light of our civilization is doing things to harm books?
It's really, really tough because, again, like the remainder marks, I get why in the library system they do the things that they do. They're efficient, the god of our civilization. They are practical. It's a utilitarian set of practices. And also, they're trying to prevent theft and, even worse damage. I've heard stories from librarians about the awful things that come back in through the library book return and how terribly damaged books are. And so I get it. But yeah, it's a damaged and in some cases, in many cases, essentially a destroyed book.
Yeah. Well, and this comes back to my talking about the difference between book collecting and book reading. I am very much in favor of the public library system. I think that there should be more books and more shelves and more trained librarians in our budgets because it's just generally good for the community. But at the same time, I also don't like my books looking like the common property of the community, to use the date due terminology from Wolf. So it's a dual thing, and I felt like they were in conflict for a while, but now I'm like, it's fine. I think the libraries are great, but I also don't want ex-library books in my collection.
Yeah, it's two different streams.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about book care since we talked about librarians not caring for books.
I have a list of a few things.
Okay, well, I think I've babbled enough. No. What are your list of book care musts?
What? You're the meadowlark of this podcast.
Am I?
People come for your melodic voice.
Yes, I'm sure of that.
So the first one is stickers. Most of the time.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, if you're buying a book used, they often will have stickers on them. I used to use Goo Gone to remove them.
Yeah, to get rid of the sticker residue.
Yeah, what I've found is it's oily and it often leaves a film, and then it kind of has a strong smell that will linger for quite a while. I've moved over to Undo sticker remover. Okay. It works fairly well.
That is pretty good.
Yeah. So, and then you kind of just dab it on there, and if the sticker's not coming off, you let it set and it'll
loosen right up.
Yeah. So
a couple other tips with that. Fingernails, if you're a person who lets them grow beyond the ends of your fingers, and have like a fingernail is really the best tool I've found for lifting and loosening the edge of a sticker. And patience is highly regarded. You can often get a sticker entirely or almost entirely off just by lifting an edge with a fingernail and then pulling it very gently and slowly.
Angles matter.
Oh yes.
So
very much so. Yeah, that's a good one. And then a hairdryer can also work because you can warm up the glue and then that loosens it a little bit. So.
Yeah, if it's newer.
Yes.
Some of the old glue you need the hairdryer doesn't work on.
Mm-mm. And then the Undo is very good. Okay, so stickers. What else?
Shelving.
Yes.
If you're gonna buy the book, why aren't you gonna buy the shelf designed for the book?
I mean, that's a good question.
To me, this goes back into the care of a collection.
Yes.
If you are going to buy the books, you wouldn't go out and buy some fancy car that you want to take care of and then leave it out on the street. You wouldn't. It's part of the total cost of ownership.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't be there. There's kind of a bit of a motto that I live by where it's like, if you buy a tool and it comes with, there's an option for the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
Buy the freaking case.
Yeah.
And that's just because tools are expensive and they need to be taken care of, but they're also in environments where they can get beat up. It's same for a book. Like, you shouldn't want to go buy a nice signed copy of a book and then put it on the floor at home where it
Right.
gets kicked or stepped on, or a cat can scratch it up, or heaven knows what else. Like you
Yeah.
come in and there's some snow on your shoes and
Oh my goodness. Yes. These are horrifying possibilities, and yet they're things that happen. And there's a scale here. Like, you do not need to purchase an acid-free clamshell box for every book that you own. There are books that do need to be stored with that kind of extra care. But the vast majority of books, including the vast majority of collectible books, are actually best on a bookshelf. Books are designed to be stored vertically, with very few exceptions. Vertical storage on a shelf with a moderate amount of tension, either provided by a nice heavy bookend or because the shelf is full enough, not so full that you can't squeeze a book in and out, but full enough that there's a little bit of pressure to the sides. That's the best for the vast majority of books. Now, some very, very large books with very fat text blocks need a little bit of support, but it's still best for them to be stored vertically. And in that case, they might need what's called a shoe, a small wedge or shim of some kind that goes under the text blocks to support it so it doesn't pull on the binding. But a shelf is the best place for a book.
Yeah, it just comes back to how you treat things in your life. It's like your flatware drawer. You shouldn't just throw everything in there.
Right.
It's like there's a reason why there's different spots for your spoons and your knives. And
right.
If you have knives that have an actual edge on them,
yes. Oh my goodness.
You want to take care of them. Like either they go in the block or they go on the magnetic strip, or you have like the little leather roll that they go in.
And you never put them in the dishwasher or put them in the sink. Yeah. You use them, wash them, and dry them immediately.
Yeah. So it's about how attentive you are to your personal possessions, and by extension, like other artifacts in this material universe we live in. Like, do you take care of things, or are you hard on them?
Yeah. And it's not just the difference between, oh, it's just easier for me to be careless, or, oh, it's more time consuming to be careful. It's, something that's cared for lasts so much longer than something that's not cared for. Something that you spend time and energy on repays you in its durability and its excellence. I think knives are a great example, because the difference between cutting with a very sharp knife and cutting with a dull knife or cutting with a half-sharpened knife is so dramatically different. If you've never used a truly sharp, truly cared-for knife, you don't know what you're missing, and you don't know how much harder your life is than it needs to be. And if you have used good knives and you know how to take care of them, and you are randomly at someone else's house and trying to use their cheap, dull, poorly cared for knife, like, that contrast is huge. And obviously we're talking about books, and we're talking about a collectible item, not a tool, but the pleasure of a clean, well cared for thing is so much higher. And we'll probably get into this a little bit more, but the value of a book that is cared for. Like, if you buy a book that's in a collectible category and you're fortunate that it's a book that remains collectible, it's just going to go up somewhat in value over time, as long as you don't let your bunny chew on it, or your dog sit on it, or your 2-year-old scribble in it with a crayon.
Yeah. Well, and another thing too along those lines, I'm going to overstate a few things, but
you never do that.
Well, yeah. But in general, each book, even if it's not a book that you enjoy, there are usually people that will enjoy that book.
Yes.
Now, we'll just go straight to the, yes, my comp. Like, there
are some notable exceptions to this rule.
Yeah. So, but generally, like, there are. So, for example, I'm not big on mystery or thrillers, but there are people that enjoy mystery and thrillers. And so sometimes, like, books come into your possession, and then you don't want to damage them. You want to make sure that you care for them, because it will go to somebody who will love that book as a physical object. And if you think about it, there's a whole chain of custody from when a book, like, if you didn't just go and buy it new off the shelf, every book that you're looking for has been through multiple owners.
Right.
And so the only reason you were able to get a copy of that book is because somebody tended and took care of it.
I think that goes to the larger question of how you regard your place in the world. Not to be too philosophical about this, but if you regard this material world and the objects in your life as objects for your consumption, then you're not caring for them as a custodian. If you regard the objects in your life as things that you are a temporary custodian of, because none of us is here forever, then you can see that there were generations before you that cared for things, and that's why you can have some of the things that you have. And there are generations coming after you, and maybe not all of these objects, but many of these objects might be things that are passed on to someone else. Maybe your own heirs, your own progeny, but maybe maybe I die and my books all go into a big book sale. And, some used bookstore owner would be delighted, I think, to acquire my collection and then sell them. And then I can just imagine the hundreds of people that could, coming through a bookshop, and whether any of these people know whether this particular book is an association copy that has this particular value to me. If they just want to read it, part of the reason that they can read that book is because I tried to take good care of it. And I think that, when it comes to the way we regard our land, our environment, the literal air that we breathe, this is the kind of thing that works its way out into, do I treat my physical goods as consumption, entertainment, like this is just for me for now? Or do I generally try to treat the world as much as I can like, oh, well, this is something that is temporarily in my custodianship and I have a responsibility to be as careful with it as I can be.
Yeah. And while very few of us are likely to have the last Lucretius nature of things sitting,
right. The single manuscript.
Yeah. There's each one of, now this is going to be hundreds of years in the future, but there'll be a point where I'm looking up at Amanda's bookshelf and there's Margaret Atwood, and there'll be a point where, we might have there's going to be a last Margaret Atwood book
at some point.
And there may be people that it's like, well, we have other writers that reference Margaret Atwood, but we don't have anything from Margaret Atwood. And maybe it won't happen, but it likely will, because we've been through this cycle several times in the course of human
when
history.
You think about Aristotle's Lost Comedy, is philosophical work on comedy. And yes, Umberto Eco wrote a whole book about it, but no one's read it. No one alive has read Aristotle's opinion on comedy because it wasn't preserved.
Yeah. I had one question. So we didn't go over this in the book collecting terms.
Yes.
But you just said association copy.
I did, and I realized there was a whole category of book collecting terms that I didn't bring up. So here we go. So there are a number of things that can increase the value of a book beyond its printed edition. One of which is whether or not it's been signed by someone, typically by the author. It's a huge collecting category. It's one that I collect in, books autographed by the author. And so there are a number of ways that a book can be autographed by the author. A very common one is an inscription, where the book has a dedication from the author to a particular person, as well as the author's own signature. An inscription can be to anyone, but one kind of inscription is an association inscription. And there are other ways for something to be an association copy, but it's the person who owned this copy of this book by this author had some other connection to the author. So perhaps a friend, perhaps a family member, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So maybe this book was owned by a famous person who isn't connected to the author, but has some prominence in their own right. That wouldn't be an association copy, but it would be a more collectible copy. So when you're looking at books, the most common thing you'll see is signed. Signed can mean anything from an inscription to just the author's signature. Typically, just the author's signature is the most value, with the exception of important association copies. So if it's just the author's signature, it should say that it is flat signed. So flat signed means it has the author's signature and nothing else. Inscription means the author dedicated it to someone. And so typically if you go to a book signing, authors will ask you your name and sign the book to you, unless you specifically request that they don't, in which case they know that you're probably just trying to increase the value of your book, and then they can get a little bit offended by that. Gene Wolfe famously did not like when people specifically asked him to flat sign things, because he felt like, oh yeah, you're just going to flip it and make more money on it.
Yeah.
Which was true for most people.
Well, yeah. So. I mean, I get it, but at the same time, I have a few of those, so it's nice to...
Yeah, so I own some flat-signed Gene Wolfe. I also own a couple of association copies. Gene Wolfe signed to a friend, and I purchased from that person after they decided that they were cleaning out their shelves.
Mm-hmm.
You can have an association copy that's not signed. There's a listing on abebooks.com right now for a copy of Out of the Silent Planet that is an association copy in that it was owned by Warnie Lewis, C.S. Lewis's brother.
Oh, okay.
And Out of the Silent Planet was dedicated to Warnie Lewis. And so it has Warnie Lewis's ownership signature in it, and it was dedicated to him. So it's not signed by Lewis, but it's signed by Lewis. So it's signed by Warnie Lewis.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's a great association copy.
Okay.
So.
No, that makes sense. Okay. I was going to ask, well, how do we know? But okay, if he's got some sort of...
His signature is in it. And I think he also has a note in it about it. So yeah, so signing, all of that. There are also other ownership marks. So you can know that a book was owned by somebody, sometimes because they wrote their name in it, which I've done. I've written my name in books before. I haven't done it very much, and I mostly did it actually more than 20 years ago before I was married, so they have my maiden name in them.
Oh, okay.
There are also embossers that emboss the paper with your name and maybe a clever saying or an emblem of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
There are book plates, which are stickers, basically large, usually nicely designed stickers that either have your name printed on them or have space for you to write your name on them. And those are commonly put into books. Gene Wolfe used a book plate in a lot of his books.
Yeah, I was going to say he's got the one with the rabbit, right?
Yeah, that he wrote his name on. But he also stamped his books with a wolf paw stamp, which is really fun. So there are lots of different ways for marks of ownership. The most common today is
where's the wolf stamp, the wolf paw stamp?
Oh, inside of the front cover.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just making, like, we didn't mention where it was. And I was like, oh, don't want pin. Yeah.
Yeah. So it puts his book plate inside the front cover and then the wolf stamp in the corner, on the lower corner of the inside cover. Yeah. Yeah. So there are a number of ways for things to be marked or signed. And those can change the collectability. Book plates and book embossing doesn't generally decrease the value of a book unless it was badly done. So, and an ownership signature, those are typically called out in the description of a book, but they're not usually a significant mark against the value of a book unless it's sloppy or messy in some way. They don't add value unless the previous owner was themselves a famous or interesting person, but they typically don't detract.
Yeah.
So.
And what about book curses?
Wait, what about book curses?
Do you have any books with book curses in the... Oh, sorry. Book curses are usually it's a little poem or
yes.
Or I'm using air quotes here, like a spell where it's
curse the person who doesn't return this.
Yeah. So it's like, may it find its way back to the author, but then they usually have like a it's a rhyming thing usually.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the curse issued against people who borrow books and don't return them, which seems a legitimate thing to do.
Oh, yeah. It's definitely one of the hidden cantos that Dante didn't really discuss.
Yes, one of the circles of hell.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we have missed some, or we need to go back to your book care. You have other book care categories or concepts or principles to talk about?
I think the main one that we didn't talk about, because we've kind of meandered.
Yes.
But that's fine. This is all interconnected. no matter how much order I try to impose on it. The only other major thing I had was so Brodart they also sell cases for magazines, so the boxes, and then the idea is you can stack them line them up
Yes.
inside the box. And so if you're collecting any of the pulps or I mean any of the larger magazines too, they also work for zines, for fanzines.
Yeah.
So I put all my magazines in there just because it's fairly easy for a magazine's pretty fragile. So.
Yeah. They also sell Mylar bags that you can slip magazines, chapbooks, that kind of thing into. One thing to be cautious about with storing books is you don't want to seal books up, or books or magazines or any paper product. You don't want to seal it up airtight without being very careful about humidity. So a protective Mylar sleeve that has some airflow possible, like a not fully sealed Ziploc, or they fold over and tape down kind of situation, is typically better. Now, there are exceptions to this, where if you're going to be in a very humid environment or storing things for a long time, and you can make sure that when they are put away, they're put away with a desiccant bag, or you know that they are very dry when you put them away, they are not humid, then you can safely seal things up. But you don't want to do that long term. You don't want to do that in general, and you can cause more problems than you prevent by sealing things up too tightly.
Yeah.
We're fortunate enough to live in a high desert environment, so humidity is not a problem for us here. There are lots of places in the world where humidity is a regular problem, and so having a well-insulated library that has a dehumidifier with a regulator on it, so it knows. So you have a setting for how humid you want it, because you can make it too dry.
Yeah.
But being cautious about too much humidity is pretty important.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about that. I was like, well, we live in a desert, so
yeah. The only thing we really contend with is dust accumulation. I have a particular problem with it because I have a non-air conditioned home in an environment that does get pretty hot. And so a lot of the year I have my windows open and I run a whole house fan that pulls in outside air. So I get accumulation of outside dust pretty easily. And every 6 months, it's a project, but every 6 months or so, I go through all of my shelves and I use a microfiber cloth to collect dust on the shelf itself. And I use a small vacuum with a soft brush and vacuum dust off the tops of books. And that depends on how much is accumulated. I won't do the full vacuum every time if they're not very dusty. So I really do like the barrister style bookshelves, although I don't have any, that have the glass fronts and close, because that reduces dust accumulation. Doesn't prevent it 100%, but it reduces it.
Yeah.
And I've also seen that historically some libraries in the Victorian era, they made what is essentially a little dust ruffle for their bookshelves. And so they'd have a bit of fabric, maybe with some tassels off the end of it, and it would hang down over the top edges of the books. And so you wouldn't get the dust accumulation on the top of the books or behind the books, which seems like a really great thing to do. I probably could manage to do it, but I don't like crafting, so I haven't done it so far.
I was going to say, if you did it right, it would look impressive. However, yes. I'm just thinking about I guess if we all owned a estate and had yes. money coming in from that, but that could get quite cost prohibitive.
Yeah, I would want to do it right, and you'd have to choose, a fabric and a design, and the tassels seem pretty important because they gently brush the tops of the books as you pull them in and out. I would want them to be uniform, and then it would be a bit of work. I do have a sibling who is an excellent sewist, and so I could probably commission the work done too, as long as I was willing to cough up either cash payment or plenty of baked goods. So when you collect books, how do you go about finding them?
2 methodologies. One, I consider the better.
Okay.
So I'm sure the first thing that pops in people's mind is, I jump on eBay or AbeBooks or, Amazon or Bookfinder. So that's good for if you specifically know what you want.
Yes.
And it's also good if the seller knows what they have.
Yes, those are two important factors for that kind of shopping. You have to know what you want, know that you want it, and the seller has to be an accurate describer of what they have.
What I actually like doing is I just like going into a physical bookstore.
Yes, this would be the second method, and it is in many ways far superior.
Yeah, because you can just wander and browse. And at the end of the day, so I was in one of our local bookstores the other day. Most inventory is not online.
Yep.
What they tend to do is the inventory that they put online is stuff that they will know will go quickly. And they had a sign up. They were wanting Brandon Sanderson, V.E. Schwab, and Sarah J. Maas. The thing is I can go to any bookstore in the valley, even the worst ones, and they all have those on the shelf because people know that the owners know that people will buy them. The problem is that there's probably a dozen other books for each one of those that I would be more interested in, but nobody's ever come in and asked about those
right.
Off the beaten path ones.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, most of your collectible stuff is not as common.
Right. I am delighted to live in a day and an age where I can use my computer, and from the comfort of my cozy leather chair sitting in my living room, I can think of a book that I want and then I can order it up. And I find that delightful both for both sides of my hobby, the book collecting hobby and the reading hobby.
Mm-hmm.
I like being able to select something, order it, and have it come to me. And when I think about how I, as a child, would anticipate a single piece of mail, and I am now in a cultural situation and in an economic position where I can do that on a regular basis, I feel beyond spoiled. A lot of the collectible books I have, I could not have had unless I were able to do that, because I have never found them in the wild. Not before I bought them, not after I bought them. But I very much agree with you here that the far superior experience is shopping in a physical bookstore. It's something I spend a good deal of money each year making sure that I can do. We're blessed in many ways in where we live, not least because we get to be neighbors. But we are not particularly blessed in the bookstore department. In our community, there were, 10 or 12, used bookstores at one point. They've mostly all closed.
Yeah.
And haven't been replaced. So to go to good bookstores, it typically involves travel. But there's just nothing to compare with browsing a bookstore shelf and finding something that fits exactly with your taste, your preferences, something that is delightful and full of joy, and you wouldn't have known in any other way. And the feeling of finding something in the wild is very different than the feeling of ordering something up. It's just it has a different flavor in every sense. I think about some years ago, I was shopping at a physical bookstore in another town, and I found they had a lovely little slip-cased copy of Shusaku Indo's Silence that was signed by Shusaku Indo in Japanese.
Oh.
And I had read that book fairly recently at that point and was, just swept away by what a powerful, horrible, but powerful book that it is.
Great book. If you haven't read it, you should read it, but it's also very sad.
Yeah. And I didn't know that I would want that, but it was absolutely the highlight of that trip.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I was in Powell's, I can't remember the author, but I walked around one of the aisles, and then I was going from one aisle to the other, and then I started walking down one, and a book literally just fell off the shelf. Like, nobody else is there. There's no earthquake. Nothing happened, but it fell off one of the higher shelves, and I looked at it, and it was paperback, and it had like the little autograph sticker on, and I was like, I don't recognize it. And I kind of flipped it over, and it had a little blurb from Jeff Vandermeer.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, oh, So I just put it in my basket, and I bought it. So
Yeah.
but
It literally leapt off the shelf at you.
uh-huh. There's
Yeah.
other things too where for certain books, like, okay, so yeah, people know most of Wolf's
Yes.
books,
Yes.
but he also has stuff that's off the beaten path, like
Yeah, like a short story in an odd collection, or a
mhm.
random chapbook.
Yeah. So and then it's like some of the stuff hasn't really been indexed anywhere,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean the same for Lafferty or Damon Knight or just Margaret Atwood. I was thinking about, like, I found she had a short story in the Mississippi Review that I didn't know about. And
Yeah.
the only way you find unless somebody has done the work,
Yes.
and then that work is specific to what you're looking for, like it gets hard,
Yeah.
and you're relying on happenstance. Because there was one time when I forget which, it was some fanzine,
Yeah.
and I was just flipping through it, and then I looked down and Wolf's name was there, and I was like,
Yep.
oh, there's a letter of comment in here.
Yep.
And it's not on the Internet Speculative Fiction Database.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
listed there.
So there would have been no other way to have found it.
No. So just going and browsing and being curious, and it's like, what's in that box? It doesn't look like it's been open for a while. What's this pile?
Well, and that's also the only way that you find something that is wildly underpriced. Because if someone's gone to the work to list it online, they've also gone to the work to research what is its current selling price.
Yeah.
So you're not going to find a bargain or a deal that way. But I can't even count the number of times that I've found something that was wildly underpriced. I found a first edition G.K. Chesterton one time, and this was at Powell's, and Powell's knows what they're doing in general. But this was the first publication of his biography of Robert Browning, and I was just looking at poetry, and I looked at this slender little Robert Browning and was like, oh, that's by G.K. Chesterton. And it was $6. And I brought it home and found out that was the first printing. And so worth significantly more than $6. I've talked before about, picking up the little Pulp House Heroes Werewolf for not very much. And I just discovered just like 2 days ago that I had 2 copies of a book that I had bought at again, that $15, $20 price point that is probably a $500 book.
Oh.
So, yeah. Those kinds of stories are a ton of fun. If you're going like looking for the big score, there's just so much knowledge to have. You can be the most knowledgeable book collector that has ever existed, and still you're going to pass by tons of things because there's just no way to know everything.
Yeah.
So it can't be your goal to find bargains, but it is also the only way to find those little hidden treasures, things you didn't know that you would like, or things that are a little underpriced for what they are.
Yeah. I guess this brings up a question. What do you think about collecting as investing?
Well, much like collecting books and reading books are 2 different hobbies, collecting books and investing are 2 wildly different categories of activity.
Yeah.
Now, I will say that if you like to buy books and you make the effort and spend a little bit extra, making sure that you get first editions, firsts as often as possible, and you pick up autographed books whenever you can, your book collection will be worth more than if you just pick up whatever random reading copy. However, if you're looking for return on investment, there are ways to do that. But that's like art collecting, which is you must be a high roller and you're participating in a speculative market with dramatic ups and downs, which is essentially a international money laundering scheme.
What?
You're not, I think if, in another 50 years, whoever my heirs happen to be, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, whatever, if that's how this all works out and I live a long time, my book collection could be a moderately valuable part of my estate. Probably much less valuable than property, other real property, or, that money invested in stocks.
Yeah.
But it's just not like if you're looking to get into it as a way to make money, the time scales are too large and the values are too chancy. Book dealers who know as much as we could possibly know and have the resources of their colleagues and subscribe to catalogs and all of that, they typically barely scrape out a living doing this, much less, valuable investment.
No, I agree with you there. Like any sort of collectible, you do not get in to invest.
Right. While acknowledging that you might make some money on some things, or you might end up with something more valuable than what you paid for it.
Yeah, that's one thing. There's all sorts of, I don't know. I guess the number of, if it's not is this mold question.
Yes.
Most of the time it's like, I found this. Is this valuable?
Right.
And it's like, wow, yeah, like you shouldn't. I would strongly suggest you not get into any of these things to flip. Thank God we don't have book flipping like on the TLC, like we have like house flipping. But
right.
I mean, it's just not. It's not really a sustainable thing. And the other thing too, you mentioned like the value, the worth of the books would be more if you select certain books.
Yes.
But one thing too that I want to point out is, so all these books on your shelf.
Yes.
You did not go out and buy these in a day.
No.
This isn't even a weekend.
No.
Like a 2-day. This is a decade long refining,
many decades,
winnowing, redirecting energies, like from. So while the on paper value, so whether you're looking at that for insurance purposes or this is what I bought them at, and when you're looking to wanting to sell, that was a slow process to get to this point.
Very much so.
And this is the thing with any sort of collectible. Now, I'm sure this is a Gene Wolfe podcast.
Yes.
So the number of times where you have spoken to somebody who likes science fiction or SF or fantasy, but they've never heard of Gene Wolfe.
Oh, I have stories.
Yeah. So the one thing to think is that even though we are collectors in a larger market, we also have a segment of our own market. So if I, heaven forbid, I were to die tomorrow, but then here's the thing. So then my heirs go to, they put all those on the market, or maybe they go to try to sell them at a bookstore.
Right.
Like what they're looking at is how quickly can we move these?
Yes.
So if you're looking at getting rid of a collection, it's going to take basically just as long as it took you to build it.
Right.
Because you have to wait for either you're waiting for a new collector to be born or to catch the bug, that spark of joy for whatever it is.
Or you're waiting for an existing collector to save enough money to purchase that item.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So collectibles are not for investing. And yes, your on paper value may be high, but you can't take that. You go into any bookstore.
Yeah.
And
I used to run a used and rare bookstore. And then since then, I have many times purchased and sold books at a used and rare bookstore. And you are typically getting somewhere between 10 and 20% of the estimated retail value of a book. Now, in certain exceptional cases, they might go as high as 50% if they are very sure that they can flip it within the next year.
Mm-hmm.
But a bookseller is typically looking at multi-year process to resell books and knows that even if this book is a collectible book, they may never sell it.
Mm-hmm.
And bookstores typically are cash poor businesses.
They're the farmers of
there's just they want to be able to make at least their cash investment back as quickly as possible, and anything beyond 20% is completely untenable for a bookstore. So I bought probably a dozen, maybe, yeah, I think it was about a dozen books this summer from an older gentleman. Very, very polite person, very nice person, collects in a particular niche, wanted to sell them. I had bought a bunch of books from the person he used to sell books to, so that's how we ended up connected. I sell some books online. He brought them over, and it was a good selection of books and had generally good value. I offered him $100 for them, and he was disappointed, but took it. And it took me more than 6 months to recoup the $100. Now, I haven't made money on them.
So you haven't made money, but that you haven't factored in your time,
your
storage costs.
Yeah, no. And so it's a dozen books taking up space on my shelves.
Mm-hmm.
I pay a listing fee every month to have my books listed.
Oh.
I have to pay to ship books out. So I've sold 2 of the dozen books that he sold me, and the sale price for those 2 books totals $115. And so by the time just the direct fees, I've barely made the $100 and no accounting for time. And so maybe the other 10 books will sell at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But in that time, I'm still paying $37 a month to list all of these books online. And I'm storing these books. And you know how important book storage space is to me. It's a genuine cost, people.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
No, that makes sense. So I'm sure somebody's thinking like, oh, well, if I cut out the middleman. But the thing that and this counts for any collecting, it books, coin stores, antique shops. The thing is that a lot of people underestimate is that having a physical space where you have all the people who are interested, like the building of a clientele over years, is not something that you can be like, oh, I'm going out to Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist or whatever. I don't know what the popular thing is these days.
Yeah, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
Now, eBay can work for some things. eBay charges higher fees in the transaction, but they don't charge a monthly fee like Abe Books does. So Abe Books requires, you should have a certain amount of inventory to justify that monthly fee. eBay, you're going to pay a slightly higher fee, but you can sell the things individually. But it's just an enormous time investment, and it still takes time to sell them. It's not like if you listed 100 books on eBay, they'd be sold tomorrow or within a week or within a month. That 100 books, you might sell 10 of them right away. You might not sell any of them for the first month. You might sell none of them. But certainly 100 books is going to take quite a while to sell. It can't be like, oh, I'll do this better. If it was easy to make money on books, booksellers love books. And so if they were making good money on it, more people would be in it. So,
yeah.
I want to ask you about Swedish death cleaning, because we've talked a bit about the time acquisition and passing on, but I've met one person who was very consciously, actually I've met a couple of people who are very consciously going through their libraries and redistributing things while they were still alive. So this process that we've talked about, like if I die and my heirs have to distribute my books, they're going to have a challenge doing so. But part of that responsible collecting thing is that at some point it should be a normal, responsible, healthy thing to at least partially redistribute or provide clear instructions for what to do with your collection.
So if you have an heir, like whether that's a nephew, a niece, kids of your own, grandchildren, who are interested in in what your collection, well, then you have it, then that's good.
That seems like the simplest, most straightforward thing. If I end up with a child, niece, nephew, great niece, nephew, grandchild, whatever, that has the degree of interest I would deem sufficient, like they would be grateful to receive a 5,000 book inheritance and not overwhelmed by it, then 100%, that's the clear path. I might clean up the collection a little bit, but that's what I would plan to do. Like,
yeah,
here's the books, and I've left you enough money to pay some movers to take care of this for you.
That would be a plus.
Yes.
And the other thing is too is if you've made that decision, they're going to take the collection in a different way.
Yep.
You can't view that as creating a legacy or any other baloney that people try to force their will onto other people with.
No, it's literally a gift. Do with it as you will.
Yeah. Now the if you don't, I mean, there's going through things, and if you own something that maybe should be in an institution, like that might be something to check out. I do have a few things that would, I have a few Wolf chapbooks that are.
So it's individual things, but it's also completeness of a collection. So if you have, like we talked about at the very beginning, if you're a collector in a niche and you have something that is recognizably complete in some sense, then keeping that all together and giving it to an institution can be a very good thing to do with it. Institutions aren't generally going to want, like a whole personal collection that covers a lot of different categories, but they will accept either individual rare, valuable items, or sometimes an institution will accept a smaller collection that is very focused because it provides them with an academic use for it.
Yeah. Yes. And thanks for the clarification on there, because I'm not just saying like, oh, load up the dump truck. But but there's certain things where if okay, so I'm thinking of like Michael Andre Drusi and Mark Armini. They've both done publications where they are referencing and they're going back and looking for references in books. If you have a book that, or a fanzine or magazine or a chapbook that isn't widely available, getting it into a special collection where they can take care of it, but then like can reproduce it so people who are doing the research, or in the future there might be enough interest for it to be published. I think that's a good thing.
Yes, I would agree with that.
So, and then the other level is like there's a certain point where you just have to start. I don't think it's a bad thing to start gifting.
Yeah.
I would gift before I sold things off.
Typically, yeah.
Yeah, because
if you could find someone you knew would appreciate it.
Yeah. So if I knew it was going to be appreciated, and appreciation can take several different, like appreciation can be like, okay, this was a gift for you. Then they can use that gift to actually get, like, maybe it's not a book they're interested in, but they can trade it for a book they're interested in.
Right.
So it's so there's different multiple facets of it. It's not like, oh, I'm a pharaoh and I want to be entombed in this book I gave you is going to be my monument. That you can't rule from the grave like that. The other thing is, I knew of a man, so he was a coin collector, and he had a very extensive collection of American coins. And he knew, so he was in his 80s.
Yep.
And he knew he was going to pass away, and his family was not interested in coins.
Yeah.
And he, like, the market value of these coins, he had individual coins that would, like, $500,000.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So he had a lot of early stuff that but he'd bought it a long time ago when the interest wasn't as high. What he did is he put each coin into an envelope. And so he had a big box of these coins. And so anytime a kid came by at a coin, so he started going to coin shows. And every time a child came by, he told the kid, oh, go ahead and pick one. And so there are kids that were, it's like, oh, it's a gold coin. It's a 10-year-old getting a gold coin, and they're like super excited about it. And there's an aspect to that. Like if you can pass it on to somebody you may not really know, but might spark a joy.
Well, and in a situation like that, you're really giving a gift to the hobby as a whole, because you're creating a magical moment for individuals that can translate into like long time care and investment. Although some of those coins maybe just went home and went into a drawer, but he still was doing something very good with it.
I don't think people always realize how fragile any hobby is.
Yeah.
We're like one step away. It's always one generation for if we don't
Right.
if people don't love reading, if we can't teach that to the next generation, if they don't love objects, the physical objects of our world, like if it's not being passed on, then it'll be forgotten. So I know of another gentleman, air quotes here. So he collects American tokens.
Okay.
So tokens were used when coins were scarce, and so usually these get called good fors or hinkies or trade tokens, merchant tokens, any number of things. And there's a couple of tokens that he has these, and their token collectors will pay like 20, 30,000 for these rare ones. He has a couple of things that are listed in catalogs as rare, but like he literally has like a bag of them.
Yeah. So he has enough to make them not rare.
Yes. He has enough to make them not rare. But the thing is he wants to gatekeep and control that.
Yep.
But the thing is like token collecting has basically died out.
Right.
Like it is not the hobby that it once was. Now, do I think book collecting and reading is going to go away? No, and we're kind of in a resurgence of like the local bookstore and Barnes and Nobles
and deluxe editions and all kinds of things.
Yes, so it's a good thing. However, it could also turn bad too. So, and if you're not passing something on to the next generation, and this isn't even, when I say that, I don't mean like just somebody in your direct line.
No. It can be someone in the world somewhere. So where like your coin giving away guy, like simply taking a good stack of books, including collectible books, and dropping them off at a used bookstore, and getting whatever pathetic payment or trade credit they offered. It's just creating a serendipitous moment for some other collector, which is a gift back to the community.
It is.
All right. Well, I think we've talked about book collecting for a while now, although I feel like I could probably go for another hour. Before we close, I think maybe we should both share one book we've collected that we particularly are delighted by or very much enjoy. So can you think of an individual volume that was an exciting or serendipitous find? I'll go first since I came up with the question, give you a chance to think. So years ago, I was at a bookstore in Portland. Love the place. It's called Mother Foucault's. And it was right after the pandemic. And we, back out shopping kind of for the first time. And I believe we're still wearing masks indoors. And I was rooting around in the back room, which was normally locked and closed, but apparently they had been using it as an ad hoc classroom for some time. So the door was open and it was a complete disaster in there. Like I was stepping over piles of papers. It was ridiculous. And I found the back corner on the back shelf a vellum-bound copy of St. Augustine's De Civitate Dei, City of God, from 1596. And I paid $400 for it, which still seems like a screaming deal, but at the time was the most I'd ever paid for a book. It is no longer the most I've ever paid for a book, but at the time was the most I'd ever paid for a single book. And it just stands out in my memory as this gloriously exciting and serendipitous moment. So,
yeah, as far as exciting, so for book club, we had A Lesson Before Dying.
Oh, yes. Right? Ernest J. Gaines.
Yeah. And I happened to be in the youth ranch, Idaho Youth Ranch, which it's a thrift store. For,
right.
For listeners.
With all thrift stores' normal grubbiness.
Grubbiness and smells and all the irritations. I picked up a hardcover copy of it.
Okay.
Read it.
Came to book club.
And then later I was putting a road art on it and I realized it was a signed first edition.
Oh my goodness. What did you pay for it?
I think I paid like $1 for it. So that one was
that's a pretty great find.
Yeah, I was pretty happy about that one.
All right. Well, that's a lot of book collecting, and maybe we'll have a follow-up at some point and then just talk at obsessive length about all of the hundreds and hundreds of things that we have collected over the years. Meanwhile, the Unreliable Narrators are Amanda Patchen and Brent Towle. And as Gene Wolfe said, We choose or choose not to be alone when we decide whom we will accept as our fellows and whom we will reject. Thus, an eremite in a mountain is in company because the birds and conies, the initiates whose words live in his forest books, and the winds, the messengers of the increate, are his companions. Another man living in the midst of millions may be alone because there are none but enemies and victims around him.